In Uru Amma, they did not bury children like Erima, and they gave them to the river. So, why did the river give her back? Before we go deeper, drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you watching from? We would love to hear from you. And please, hit that subscribe button. Uru Amma was not a village you found on any map. It was a place the water built a cluster of wooden homes, balanced on stilts above the dark, breathing creeks of Bayelsa State, deep in the heart of the Niger Delta. To reach it, you had to know which canoe to board and which waterway to follow, because the channels shifted like living things, and strangers who came without invitation rarely arrived where they intended. The Ijaw people of Uru Amma had lived on the water for longer than memory could hold. Their canoes were not tools, they were extensions of the body. A man without his canoe in Uru Amma was a man without legs. A woman who could not read the current was considered unformed, incomplete. Children learned to paddle before they learned to walk on solid ground, and the river was spoken to in ceremony, in prayer, in the small whispered negotiations of daily life. Because the Ijaw knew what many had forgotten, that water is not empty. Water remembers. Water decides. The village held perhaps 200 souls. Fishermen who rose before the sun, women who smoked and salted fish on open racks, while trading news across the water in voices that carried far. Elders who sat at the edge of the bank in the evenings and watched the current the way other old people watched fire, reading it, trusting it, fearing it in equal measure. And above all of them, woven into the fabric of every birth and death and season, was the belief in Woyingi, the supreme creator, a feminine force, tender and absolute and Indi Owamapu, the water spirits who moved beneath the surface and governed the fate of those who lived above it. This was the world Erima was born into. And this was the world that decided, before she drew her first full breath, that she did not belong in it. It was a moonless night in the rainy season when Erima came into the world, and everything about her arrival was wrong according to those who kept count of such things. Her mother, a young Igbo woman named Adaeze, who had come to Uru Amma as a trader's wife, died in the labor. In Ijaw belief, a child whose birth kills the mother carries a particular suspicion, the elders said. Such children sometimes arrived, already bargaining, already taking, and then there was the silence. Erima did not cry when she was born. She looked. She opened her eyes in the dim lamplight of that rain-soaked room, and she looked at the ceiling, at the midwife's hands, at the shadows pulling in the corners, as though she recognized the place and was disappointed to be back. The midwife stepped back. The elder women gathered in the doorway exchanged a look that needed no translation. By morning, word had moved through Uru Amma the way words always moved, faster than canoes, quieter than water. The child was Ogbanje, a spirit being wearing the skin of a baby. She had taken her mother as payment for the return trip. She would take more if left to grow. She would cycle and destroy and vanish back into the spirit world laughing. And the family, what remained of it, would be hollowed out, one grief at a time. The father, a quiet Ijaw fisherman named Tonye, sat outside his home and did not speak. He had lost his wife. Now the village was asking him to lose the child as well. An elder woman, the most respected in the village, a grandmother figure named Mama Ebi, placed her hand on his shoulder and told him what needed to be done. Her voice was not cruel. That was the most devastating part. Her voice was kind. She believed every word she said. 2 men took a canoe out before dawn. The river was perfectly still that morning. Not calm, but still, in the particular way that made the older fishermen uneasy. The way that meant something below the surface was paying attention. They unwrapped the cloth once, looked at the child's face, then wrapped her again, and they threw her in. The water swallowed her, then went silent. Then the bundle rose. The river gave her back. There are things that live in the Niger Delta waterways that no government survey has ever documented. The Ijaw have always known this. They do not speak of these things carelessly or loudly, because naming a thing in the wrong tone is the same as calling it. Ogbeni Omi the Lord, beneath the still water, had no beginning that any living elder could point to. But the oldest stories, the ones told only in whispers and only to those who would one day need to know them, said that he was born from a specific moment of human cruelty. Centuries ago, before Uru Amma had a name, a child was drowned in that creek, an innocent child, condemned by the same fear, the same word, ogbanje. That child's grief did not dissolve in the water. It sank. It settled into the silt and the darkness and the cold. And over generations, it grew into something vast and patient and hungry. Ogbeni Omi did not hunt. He waited. He could wear the face of anyone a person loved, a mother, a husband, a child, and appear in dreams as a lullaby that stole the will to wake. He could not touch moving water. He could only operate in stillness, in the stagnant pools between the mangrove roots, in the water at the bottom of an untouched clay pot, in the terrible quiet of a creek on a windless night. And he could not take anyone who had not, in some part of themselves, opened a door. He had been fed for generations by the grief of Uru Amma's unloved. Every 7 years, an elder of the village, not publicly, not in ceremony, but in a small, unspeakable act of quiet arrangement, would ensure that someone who was already broken, already halfway gone, would find themselves alone near still water at night. It was called balance. It was called the price of peace. Nobody wrote it down. Everybody knew. Ogbeni Omi was not growing stronger because Uru Amma was wicked. He was growing stronger because Uru Amma was afraid, and fear, left unexamined long enough, will always find someone small to feed itself with. He had been watching Erima since before she was born. Not with hunger, with recognition. Because he knew what she was, even if she did not. And he knew that if the village destroyed her before she understood her own nature, the door between his world and theirs would open and never close again. Nobody in Uru Amma raised Erima. She was raised by the spaces between the gap between one household's generosity and another's suspicion, the margin of the village where the unwanted learned to make themselves small and useful enough to survive. She fetched water. She mended nets. She was quick and quiet and rarely met anyone's eyes directly, because she had learned early that her gaze unsettled people, not because there was anything wrong with her eyes, but because they looked at you as though they already knew the answer to the question you hadn't asked yet. She was 7 when she first heard Ogbeni Omi's lullaby soft and low, threading through a dream like smoke through cloth. She woke with her heart hammering and her hands wet, though there was no water near her sleeping mat. She told no one. There was no one to tell. She was 12 when the Iria ceremonies came, the sacred fattening rooms, where the young women of Uru Amma were welcomed into womanhood. The girls were secluded for weeks, fed and adorned with coral beads and white chalk, their skin oiled and their hair dressed, while the older women taught them what it meant to step into their full selves. It was a threshold, a homecoming. Every girl in the village passed through it. Erima stood outside and listened to the singing from a distance, alone in her canoe on the water, and said nothing. The village did not debate whether to include her. The village simply did not think of her at all, which was, in many ways, worse. But the river thought of her. And the river, when she lay in her canoe in the dark and let her fingers trail in the current, spoke to her in sensation, in warmth and cold and pressure and pull, telling her things she had no language for yet, but recognized in her bones as true. She was not nothing. She was not a mistake. She was not what they said she was. She was Omi Woyingi. She did not know what that meant. But the water did. What the people of Uru Amma did not know, what the audience watching from the beginning already understood, was that Erima's presence in the village was not a curse. It was a lock. From the moment the river refused to take her, Erima had been functioning as a living seal over the deep water where Ogbeni Omi slept. Her grief kept her close to the surface of her pain present, feeling open, and that openness, that refusal to go numb, was the very thing that held the door shut. The Owamapu, the water spirits, had placed something inside her at birth. Not a power she could wield like a weapon, but a quality of being that disrupted the stillness Ogbeni Ome required to rise. Every time a villager rejected her, they chipped at that seal. Every cruelty, every exclusion, every moment she was made to feel like an error, each one brought the water 1 degree closer to stillness. The Egbesu masquerade dancers had appeared twice in the village that year, once at the dry season festival, moving with that particular jerking urgency that the elders recognized as warning, not celebration. A fisherman had drowned in still water with no explanation. A young mother had begun sleepwalking toward the creek at night and could not explain why. The signs were legible to anyone trained to read them, and Mama Ebi, the eldest woman of the village, read them clearly. She knew exactly what was happening. She knew exactly why. And she had known since the night she placed her hand on a grieving father's shoulder and told him, in a voice made kind by certainty, that the baby had to go. Mama Ebi had been, in her own strange way, watching over Erima for years. Not openly, not with warmth that anyone else could see, but in small deniable ways. A piece of fish left near the place Erima slept, a word deflected when another villager's cruelty was about to cross a line that could not be uncrossed. Erima had noticed. Erima, who had trained herself to read the smallest gestures the way her people read the current, had built something quiet and fragile around this woman, not trust. Exactly, but something that wanted very badly to become trust. When Erima was 17, Mama Ebi called her to the edge of the bank one evening and sat with her in silence for a long time, watching the Egbesu dancers move at the far end of the village in the low red light of the sun going down. Then she began to speak about the river, about Woyingi, about the nature of what lived beneath still water. She did not say Erima's name during any of it, but everything she said was about Erima. It was the closest thing to a mother's voice Erima had ever heard. She did not know, sitting there, that this woman had been the one to give the order. She found out 3 days later from a dying fisherman who had been there that night and who wanted to leave the world without the weight of it. He told her simply, without decoration, the way old men sometimes tell the truth when they have run out of reasons to protect anyone. Erima sat with that information for a very long time in her canoe, alone on the water, while the current told her things in sensation that she was not yet ready to receive. The choice came to Erima, the way impossible things always do, not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a quiet moment in which the full weight of 2 unbearable things settled onto her shoulders simultaneously and waited. She could expose Mama Ebi. She could stand in the center of Uru Amma and name what was done to her and demand that the village finally see her, really see her for the first time. The acknowledgement she had ached for, since before she had words for aching. The justice that a child thrown into a river before her first sunrise was owed by every measure of human decency. But Mama Ebi was the only living person who knew the sealing ritual, the only one who carried the specific words and gestures and river offerings that could close the door on Ogbeniomi permanently. If her standing collapsed, and in Uru Amma, shame moved fast and hit hard, she would be gone before the ritual could be performed. And the Lord, beneath the still water, would rise with nothing to stop him, or Erima could say nothing. She could swallow the knowledge the way she had swallowed every other wound. She could protect the woman who had handed her to her death. She could be, once again, the one who disappeared quietly for the comfort of others. She understood, in that stillness, that the village had not changed. It was still asking her to be small. It was still asking her to vanish. The only difference now was that she was the one choosing it. The creek went completely still on a night with no wind and no moon, the kind of stillness that made the fishing dogs whine and refuse to go near the bank. Children were pulled inside. Fires were built higher than necessary. And beneath the surface of the water, something that had been patient for centuries felt the lock finally beginning to give. Ogbeniomi rose wearing a face Erima had never seen but recognized immediately the face of the mother she had never had. He stood at the edge of the water in the dark and sang the lullaby in a voice that made the grief in her chest feel like rest. And for one long, terrible moment, she understood why people followed him in. Not because they were weak, because they were exhausted. Because the offer of peace, even a false one, is almost impossible to refuse when you have never once been given the real thing. Erima stood on the bank and felt every year of her life pressing against the backs of her eyes. Then she went to find Mama Ebi. She did not expose her. She did not forgive her either. Not the way stories sometimes require, clean and complete and convenient. She simply went to her and said, "I know what you did. I know what you know. And we are going to do the ritual tonight. And then we are going to talk about what comes after." Mama Ebi looked at her for a long moment. Then the old woman nodded. Together, at the bank, they performed the river naming ceremony, not for a new body of water, but as a reclamation of the one that had always been Erima's offerings on the surface. Specific words in Izon passed down through generations and nearly lost. And then Erima stepped into the water. Not thrown, not dragged. She walked in with open eyes, knowing the cost, choosing it anyway. The water rose around her waist, around her chest. And Ogbeniomi screamed, not with rage, but with the sound of grief that has finally, after centuries, been witnessed. Because Erima, even in her own wounding, did not look away from his pain. She held it. And what a thing cannot hide inside, it cannot survive. The water surged. The current returned. The creek moved. And the Lord beneath the still water went back to the deep, a dark pre-dawn. The same bank, the same mangrove trees, standing at the edge of the water like witnesses that have always been here. But this time, Erima stood with her feet in the moving current, not bundled in cloth, not silent with a silence that came from being unable to speak, but quiet in the way of someone who has finally said everything that needed saying. The village behind her was asleep. The water ahead of her was moving. And in her chest, for the first time in 19 years, something had stopped straining toward a love that was never going to come from the direction she had been looking. The river had known her before her own name was given. The river had refused her death before she could refuse it herself. And now, standing in the current in the grey light before sunrise, she understood what the water had always been saying in sensation when she lay in her canoe and let her fingers trail beneath the surface. You were never the curse. You were always the cure. And you were always, always ours. The sun broke the horizon. The water caught it and scattered it in every direction, the way only moving water can. Erima did not smile or weep. She simply stood there in the river, belonging to it and to herself, which turned out to be the same thing. Among the Ijao, there is a saying, the river does not forget what was thrown into it. It only decides what to do with what it keeps.